let's talk for a minute about open source software in education. If you've been following the open source movement for any length of time, you know that there's a growing call to teach only open source in schools and to have only open source in schools. Let's eliminate the proprietary software, let's get rid of Windows, let's get rid of Office, and let's install Ubuntu and LibreOffice and teach all open source software to our kids. And so the idea goes that when they enter the workforce, they're going to take those skills with them and open source will take over the business world. Unfortunately, I have a slightly more pessimistic and a slightly more, I believe, realistic view of that. And I believe that teaching only open source software and eliminating proprietary software from education would be disastrous. And it actually would cripple our children and harm them, preventing them from effectively competing in what's an incredibly competitive international marketplace. Now, I'm not saying there's not a place for open source software in schools, and I believe that it should definitely be on the desktop. It has its place in the curriculum. It's got its place within the infrastructure. I definitely think that schools should move away from Windows as much as possible, but I don't think they should eliminate open source or proprietary software completely, because here's what's going to happen. Kids are going to take all this open source goodness, they're going to be gung-ho about all these great open source and free programs, and they're going to jump into that job as a video editor, or they're going to jump into that job as a network administrator, or they're going to jump into that job as an executive assistant, and they're going to be faced with proprietary software. They're going to be faced with software they don't know anything about. And that's going to cripple them. That's going to harm them. And you know what's going to happen? They're going to find themselves with all these fantastic open source skills, but virtually unemployable. And I know that a lot of you are thinking, well, they'll just go find jobs at companies that are open source friendly. Well, where are the jobs going to be? Because if we teach our children open source, there's only so many jobs that are going to be available in these open source friendly companies, and it's going to be incredibly competitive, and there won't be enough jobs to fill the demand. So I think the people that advocate open source only, and admittedly it's not a lot of people, but there is a growing number of people around the world that are doing it, are crazy. They don't think about the unintended consequences if we just ditched all the proprietary software. Now, what would be a reasonable and sensible way to move forward? Let's teach a hybrid. Let's teach a little bit of OpenOffice or LibreOffice alongside with Microsoft Office. Let's teach network administration skills for both Windows and Linux. Let's teach the Linux desktop as well as the Windows desktop. There's room for both in the ecosystem, and we can turn out kids that are amazingly prepared for an international community that's going to be just crazily competitive. But for God's sake, don't eliminate proprietary software. I'm not saying that eventually it shouldn't go away, but right now we have to deal in reality, and unfortunately the people that believe that we should teach only open source, they're not really living in reality. They may be working in their own little companies where they can get away with using, all open source software, but the reality is most of us live in the real world, and most of us don't have that luxury. I'm an open source guy. I write open source software. But I use a lot of proprietary software, not because I want to, not because I think it's superior, not because I think it's fantastic, but because I have to. It's what my clients use. It's what my friends use. And people aren't going to change just because you have some moralistic view of what software should be. People are going to use what they use at work. They're going to use it at home. What they use, and they're going to use that in their organizations. And you're going to be left out in the dust if you don't know how to integrate with that. So for God's sake, get over the moralistic view that open source is the only way to go. Sure, it's the best way to go from a freedom standpoint, but it certainly doesn't have to be some moral war where we handicap our kids from effectively competing in the global marketplace. Get over the religion and look at reality. Step outside of your own little circle of comfort and realize that in the reality of the situation is we live in a dual world. We live in a world where both open source and free and proprietary software can coexist, and they're going to have to coexist for the foreseeable future. Now, I know, like I said, not everyone is all let's get rid of let's get rid of proprietary and go open source, but like I said, it's a growing number, and it concerns me because that growing number tends to have a fairly heavy influence in the education market, and that scares the hell out of me because I think that it's on the verge of really hurting our kids. So think about it, and if you have a rebuttal, by all means, post it. I want to hear your opinions, but if it's a moral issue for you, schools aren't there to teach moral issues. Schools aren't there to teach ethics. Schools are there to educate future people to go into industry and compete and to work. And if you are arguing for open source because it's a moral issue, then you're on the wrong side of history and you're on the wrong side of freedom. And I encourage you to rethink your stance.